She only closed her eyes for a moment, but when the CEO woke up, her life was resting on a stranger's shoulder, and nothing would ever be the same. Would you call that fate or just a coincidence? Comment your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more heart-stopping stories. The late afternoon sun poured through the glass walls of Logan Airport, turning the crowded terminal into a blur of light and motion. Clara Whitmore kept her stride measured, heels striking against the floor in practiced rhythm, her leather briefcase swinging like a shield at her side. 29, founder and CEO of a thriving Boston tech firm, she carried herself with the poise of someone used to being watched. Yet behind the flawless suit and designer sunglasses, fatigue tugged at every step. She told her team she was flying to Seattle for a conference. But in truth, she was running. Running from boardroom whispers, from the sting of a lost contract, from the penthouse that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Success had never left so much emptiness in its wake. She scrolled through emails as she walked, the screen's glow reflecting in her tired eyes. Deals demanded answers. Investors demanded certainty. Everyone wanted something from her. No one saw the quiet fracture inside, the longing for a place where she could simply breathe. Clara told herself love was a distraction, vulnerability, a liability. Yet even she couldn't ignore the heaviness pressing down, begging for distance from the empire she had built. Just beyond the same gate, Daniel Hayes shifted his worn backpack from one shoulder to the other, his fingers brushing against a chipped red toy airplane tucked into the side pocket. 3-3. Once a promising software developer, now a single father chasing another chance. His son Ethan, only 6, was home in bed with a fever, watched over by their kind neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. The photo that had just buzzed onto his phone showed Ethan trying to smile over a bowl of soup. It both comforted and pierced him. Every mile he traveled away from that little boy felt like leaving part of his own heart behind. The job interview in Seattle was supposed to be a lifeline. Steady pay, benefits, and stability after years of scraping by since Claire left. But none of that made the choice easier. Guilt clung to him like a shadow. He told himself he was doing this for Ethan, but it didn't stop the ache of absence. The final boarding call crackled through the loudspeakers just as Daniel turned, hurrying toward the gate. At that same instant, Clara, head bent over her phone, stepped into his path. The collision was abrupt. Her briefcase swung open, papers sliding across the polished floor, a lipstick rolling until it tapped against a chair leg. Daniel dropped immediately, gathering the scattered pages with quick, apologetic hands. Sorry, he muttered, eyes darting back to his buzzing phone. Clara crouched as well, irritation flashing in her sharp features. Their fingers brushed over the same sheet of paper. She looked up, ready to scold, only to meet a pair of weary eyes that carried more weight than his words ever could. For a heartbeat. The noise of the terminal seemed to soften. Then the boarding announcement rose again, pulling them both forward. Clara snapped her briefcase shut. Daniel clutched the toy airplane as though it steadied him. Two strangers, already moving past each other, unaware that this hurried moment at Gate 17 had quietly bent the course of their lives toward the same sky. The line of passengers moved slowly down the narrow aisle, the hum of conversation blending with the soft roar of engines warming for departure. Clara adjusted her blazer, eyes scanning the seat numbers with practiced detachment. All she wanted was quiet, a few hours to bury herself in spreadsheets and emails, to remind herself that she was still in control of something. When she reached her row, she stopped short. The man from the gate was already there, settled by the window, his worn backpack tucked beneath the seat, the red toy airplane resting in his hand. For a fleeting second, Clara considered asking the flight attendant if another seat might be available, but the announcement had already rung clear. The flight was full. With a quiet sigh, she slid into the aisle seat, her briefcase pressed neatly against her legs. The air between them felt thick with unspoken recognition, the awkward memory of scattered papers and brushed fingers lingering. Clara wasted no time. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen a deliberate barrier. Her fingers began to fly across the keys, each tap sharp, efficient, almost defiant. If she kept her eyes locked on work, if she buried herself in numbers and strategies, maybe she could silence the nagging awareness of the man sitting just inches away. Daniel shifted slightly, leaning back against the headrest. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze lingered on the small airplane in his palm, thumb tracing the chipped paint as though the motion itself kept him tethered. To anyone else, it was just a toy. To him, it was Ethan's blessing. Ethan's belief that a piece of plastic could help keep a real plane safe. 6-year-old logic, pure and unshakable. Daniel clung to it the way other men might cling to prayer. The engines rumbled louder, the cabin lights dimmed, and the city of Boston began to slip away beneath them. Clara's eyes burned from the glow of her screen, but she forced herself to keep typing. She told herself she was fine. She was focused. She was in control. Yet out of the corner of her eye, she caught the steady rhythm of his hand on the toy plane. The small curve of a smile that came and went when he looked at it. For reasons she couldn't explain, it unsettled her, not because it was strange, but because it was tender. A tenderness she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Clara pressed her lips together, tightening her grip on the laptop as if she could push the thought away. Daniel, meanwhile, felt the exhaustion of the day pulling at him. He thought of Ethan's flushed cheeks, Mrs. Alvarez's careful voice on the phone, the fragile hope that tomorrow would bring better news. He wanted to focus on the interview ahead to rehearse his answers in his mind. But instead, he found himself listening to the quiet rhythm of typing beside him. The woman next to him radiated efficiency, every movement sharp and precise. Yet, when she tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, he noticed the faintest tremor in her fingers, a sign she wasn't as unshakable as she seemed. Minutes passed in silence, heavy yet charged. Clara fought her drowsiness with another sip of champagne. Daniel tightened his hold on the toy airplane, and the distance between them seemed both impossibly wide and far too small. Neither spoke, but both felt the strange weight of sharing the same row, the same breath of air, the same invisible thread pulling two separate worlds slowly. Inevitably closer together, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, a sound both soothing and relentless. Clara kept her eyes locked on the glow of her laptop, forcing herself to read the same line of her report again and again. Numbers blurred together, the text refusing to hold still. 72 hours of little more than coffee and adrenaline had finally caught up with her, and no amount of willpower could push the exhaustion back any longer. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, willing her mind to stay sharp, but the screen dimmed, her eyelids heavy. Just a minute, she told herself. Just a breath. Daniel sat quietly beside her, the toy airplane resting in his palm. He could feel the weight of fatigue radiating from the woman next to him, though she fought hard to conceal it. There was something almost admirable in her determination to remain composed, but it also stirred something else in him. He knew what it was to carry too much, to act stronger than you felt. Ethan had shown him, time and again, that even the bravest needed rest. The plane shuddered gently as it slipped through a pocket of turbulence. Clara's head tipped almost imperceptibly at first, until finally gravity pulled her toward him. Blonde hair brushed his shoulder, the scent of her shampoo mingling with the faint traces of airport coffee on his shirt. Daniel froze, instinct urging him to shift away, to protect the fragile barrier of distance between strangers. But then he saw her face without the hard edge of focus, without the sharp lines of authority. She looked human. The dark circles under her eyes spoke louder than her expensive suit ever could. There was something fragile about the way she had surrendered to sleep, as if even in rest, she couldn't quite let go of the weight she carried. Daniel adjusted slightly, careful not to wake her, letting his shoulder become her pillow. It wasn't much, but it felt like something he could give. His thumb kept moving over the toy airplane, tracing familiar grooves while her breath steadied against his arm. For the first time all day, he felt less alone. Time slipped away. 90 minutes passed in quiet stillness. The cabin lights low, the world outside painted in streaks of orange and violet. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window where the horizon seemed infinite. He thought of Ethan curled against him on stormy nights, the small comfort of knowing that presence alone could make a child feel safe. Somehow the same instinct carried over now. This woman didn't know him. She hadn't asked for his kindness, but she needed rest, and he could offer it. Clara stirred slowly, awareness seeping back like waves against the shore. The first thing she noticed was warmth. The second was the faint scent of soap and cotton. Then came the realization, sharp and mortifying, that her cheek rested against the shoulder of the man she had snapped at in the terminal. Her eyes flew open. A small damp patch marked his shirt where she had drooled in her sleep. Horror rushed through her veins. Clara Whitmore did not fall asleep on strangers. She did not lose control. Not in public, not ever. She sat upright too quickly, brushing at her jacket, fumbling for words that refused to come. An apology caught in her throat, tangled with pride and embarrassment. Daniel turned his head toward her, a gentle smile tugging at his tired features. He raised a hand, dismissing her panic before she could voice it. "It's fine," he said softly, his tone carrying a calm warmth that wrapped around her shame like a blanket. "Really? It's been a long time since anyone's found me comfortable enough to fall asleep on. So thank you." His kindness unraveled something inside her. The knot she'd been carrying in her chest loosened just a little. Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, struggling to rebuild her professional facade. But the damage was done. He had seen her human, and for reasons she couldn't explain. It didn't feel as terrible as it should have. Clara kept her eyes down for a long moment, cheeks warm with the kind of embarrassment she wasn't used to feeling. But the gentle ease in Daniel's smile softened the edges of her pride against her better judgment. She let out a quiet laugh, small but real, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in far too long. It was the laugh that opened the door. "Do you always travel with an airplane in your hand?" she asked, nodding toward the chipped red toy resting on his knee. Her voice carried a trace of teasing, but there was curiosity beneath it. Daniel turned the toy slowly, his thumb brushing the faded paint. "It's not mine. It belongs to my son. Ethan, he insisted I bring it. Said it would help the real plane fly safer." His smile grew, touched with pride. 6-year-old logic is pretty bulletproof. Something shifted inside Clairol at the way he said his son's name. It wasn't casual, it was reverent. Like the word itself was a treasure he couldn't risk breaking. For a woman who had built walls against sentiment. The sound of it pierced deeper than she expected. She closed her laptop, surprising even herself, and leaned slightly toward him. "So, you're not on this flight for vacation?" He chuckled softly, not even close. "Job interview in Seattle. Software positions. We just moved to the city, trying to start over." He kept his tone light, but Clara caught the shadows beneath it. The effort of making life sound easier than it was. "And Ethan," she asked, "does he like living in a new place?" "He likes dinosaurs," Daniel said, grinning now. "Well, he used to. Last week he announced he's officially moved on to space. Saturn specifically. Did you know it has 62 moons?" Clara arched a brow. "I can barely manage one life. 62 moons sounds excessive." Daniel laughed, and for a moment, the exhaustion on his face lifted. It was a warm, human sound that settled between them more comfortably than the hum of the engines. Clara found herself smiling back, a response she hadn't planned. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and the light in his expression dimmed. His thumb moved quickly across the keyboard, the crease between his brows deepening. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice softer now. He swallowed, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Alvarez says Ethan's fever spiked again." She called the doctor, but his words trailed off, heavy with fear he was trying to contain. Clara's chest tightened. She had no reason to care about this stranger's child. Yet the thought of a sick little boy waiting for his father pulled at something in her she hadn't expected. Before she could respond, the plane jolted violently, a burst of turbulence rattling the cabin. Gas rippled through the rows as overhead bins shuddered. Without thinking, Clara's hand shot across the armrest, gripping Daniel's arm, her nails pressed lightly against the fabric of his shirt. His first instinct was to cover her hand with his, steady and warm. "It's okay," he said, voice calm despite the worry still flickering in his eyes. "Just air pockets. The plane's built for much worse than this." She should have pulled away once the shaking eased, but she didn't, and he didn't move his hand either. For several long breaths, they remained like that, hands joined, two strangers suspended above the world, tethered together by fear, by kindness, and by something neither of them had the courage or the language to name. The quiet after the turbulence seemed to linger, their hands still joined as if neither dared to break the fragile thread. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again, the sound sharp against the hush of the cabin. He glanced at the screen and the color drained from his face. His grip on her hand tightened before he remembered himself and let go. "What is it?" Clara asked, already knowing from the look in his eyes that the news wasn't good. Daniel drew a shaky breath. Mrs. Alvarez called an ambulance. Ethan's fever spiked to 104. He's at the hospital now. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled, betraying the storm beneath. The cabin seemed smaller, suddenly, the air thinner. Daniel's chest rose and fell too quickly as he typed a rushed reply, asking for details he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "How long until we land?" he whispered, as if the question itself might change the answer. Clara looked at her watch, though she'd already heard the captain's earlier announcement. 2 hours, she said softly. 2 hours might as well have been 2 lifetimes. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pressing his hands together in a futile attempt to hold himself steady. "I should be there. He needs me. What if?" His voice cracked, unfinished sentences piling up like wreckage. Clara surprised herself. She didn't try to fill the silence with logic or comfort. Instead, she turned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but firm. "Tell me about him." Daniel blinked, thrown off balance. "What, tell me about Ethan?" she said again, her eyes steady on his. "Well, we're up here and you can't do anything else. Tell me who he is." It took a moment, but then something inside him loosened. Words spilled out, uneven at first, then rushing like water through a broken dam. He told her about Ethan's first word, airplane. Naturally, about his obsession with dinosaurs that had recently been replaced by an obsession with the solar system. About the way he insisted on wearing his Superman cape to the grocery store. About the sound of his laugh, the way he concentrated with his tongue poking out when he drew. The stubborn brilliance that sometimes drove him to tears when he couldn't get things just right. Clara listened. Really listened in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in years. Not for leverage, not for strategy, not to find an opening in a negotiation, just to witness love in its purest form. Spoken by a father who was terrified of losing his child. Each detail pressed against the walls she had built around herself, reminding her of feelings she had long buried beneath ambition. "He's everything good I've ever done," Daniel said finally. His voice raw, rolled into one small person. "I can't lose him." "You won't," Clara said, though she had no right to make promises. Yet something in her tone carried conviction, as though she had borrowed his own love to speak it back to him. When the plane touched down in Seattle, Daniel was already on his feet, backpack slung over his shoulder, urgency in every line of his body. Clara stood too, her own luggage forgotten for the moment. "I'll help you get to the hospital," she said before he could protest. "You don't have to." "I want to." Her tone left no room for argument. Consider it repayment for the shoulder for the minutes later. She had summoned a car faster than any cab could have been found at the curb. Daniel hesitated, torn between gratitude and disbelief. The harsh lights of the pickup zone cast every worry line on his face into sharp relief. He looked at her, eyes heavy with both exhaustion and something unspoken. "Thank you, Clara," he said quietly. She only nodded. "Go. Ethan needs you." And then he was gone. Swallowed into the stream of headlights, leaving her standing alone with her designer luggage at her feet, watching a stranger disappear into the night, feeling strangely untethered in a way she hadn't expected. The hotel room felt too quiet, too polished, too far removed from the chaos that still lingered in Clara's mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, the conference welcome packet unopened on the desk, her phone glowing in her hand. For 20 minutes she had stared at the screen, Daniel's number saved there after their hurried exchange on the plane. Finally, she typed the words before she could second-guess herself. "How is Ethan?" The reply came almost instantly. "Fever broke, he's sleeping. Doctor says he'll be fine." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her like warm water, leaving her shaken. Then, without pausing, she typed again. "Which hospital? Children's Memorial?" Why, she didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her coat, her heels clicking softly against the hotel floor as she ordered another car. The hospital at night was a different world. Bright lights hummed against pale walls, footsteps echoed down sterile corridors, and voices dropped to a hush meant to protect fragile sleep. When Claire asked for room 312, the nurse's smile carried a hint of knowing, as though she'd seen this kind of quiet devotion before. Daniel was there, slumped in a chair beside the bed, both hands wrapped around his son's much smaller one. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but he didn't seem to notice. On the bed lay Ethan, Tiny, pale, but breathing steadily, blonde hair damp with sweat. The toy airplane rested on the blanket near his hand, as though guarding him through the night. Daniel looked up when Clara entered, surprise flickering across his face. "You came," he whispered, his voice caught between exhaustion and gratitude. "I couldn't concentrate on quarterly projections knowing you were here," she said lightly, setting down the bag. She carried a teddy bear from the gift shop, good coffee from across the street, sandwiches she suspected Daniel hadn't thought to eat. For a moment, he said nothing, only blinked at her as if trying to understand why someone like her would choose to be here at all. Then Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were Daniel's eyes, warm, brown, and full of life, despite the fever's toll. He looked at his father, then at Clara, curiosity sparking in his gaze. "Are you Daddy's friend?" His voice was hoarse, small but steady. Clara moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "I suppose I am," she said gently. "Your dad told me all about you on the airplane. He says you like dinosaurs." Ethan wrinkled his nose. "Used to. I like space now. Saturn has 62 moons, even weak." The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Clara smiled, settling on the edge of the bed. 62? That seems like far too many. I can barely keep up with one schedule. "How does Saturn manage?" The boy giggled, a sound that seemed to lift the heaviness from Daniel's shoulders. "They don't all have names, some are just numbers. That's sad." "Right, everyone should have a name." "You're absolutely right," Clara agreed. "What would you name them?" And just like that, the room filled with laughter as Ethan launched into an elaborate list of moon names inspired by his favorite foods and superheroes. Daniel watched silently, his expression softening in a way Clara hadn't seen before. For hours they stayed like that, sharing stories, telling jokes, weaving light into the sterile corners of a hospital room. Nurses passed in and out, smiling at the unlikely trio who had somehow turned fear into warmth. Later, as the night stretched past 3 Oak in the morning and Ethan drifted back into peaceful sleep, Clara sat in the chair beside Daniel, her heels kicked off, her jacket draped over the back. Silence settled between them, comfortable now instead of awkward. She glanced at the boy, then back at Daniel. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I've spent so long building walls, protecting myself, making sure every move I make has a return on investment. But tonight, watching you with him, hearing the way you love him," she paused, her throat tight. "It made me realize I've forgotten what love looks like when it isn't transactional, when it's just given." Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the space between them, his thumb brushing gently against her hand. And in that small gesture, Clara felt something inside her shift, as though a door she hadn't opened in years had been quietly unlocked. The first light of morning crept through the thin blinds of room 312, painting everything in muted gold. Daniel stood at the small sink, splashing cold water over his face, trying to wash away the heaviness of the night. Ethan's color had returned, his breathing steady, and for the first time in days. Relief loosened the knot in Daniel's chest. Still, a new weight pressed on him. The interview. It had felt impossible to leave, but Claire had insisted. "He'll be fine," she'd said, her voice calm and certain. "Go do this for him." So he went, clutching his worn folder of resumes, still smelling faintly of antiseptic from the hospitals. The questions at the office blurred together. Skills, experience, the inevitable gaps in his resume. But Daniel answered steadily, carrying Ethan's face in his mind like a compass. When the hiring manager asked why he wanted the bomb, he told the truth. "Because I need to build a life my son can depend on." And to his surprise, honesty seemed enough. By the end of the meeting, the handshake carried weight. He had the job. Back at the hospital, Daniel paused outside the door before stepping in. What he saw made his breath catch. Clara was sitting in the chair beside Ethan's bed, laptop balanced on her knees, phone resting on the tray table. Her jacket hung neatly on the chair back, her heels tucked aside. She looked nothing like the untouchable CEO from yesterday. She looked present, human. Ethan was propped up with pillows, a coloring book open on his lap, crayons scattered across the sheets. Clara glanced up from her screen every few minutes, offering comments that made the boy laugh. She had just leaned over to suggest that one of Saturn's unnamed moons should be called Pancake, and Ethan giggled so hard his cheeks flushed pink again. The sound filled the room, bright and alive, Daniel lingered at the threshold, watching for a moment longer before stepping inside. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. The smile she gave him wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was simple, genuine, and for him alone. "Well," she asked. "I got it," he said, still half in disbelief. "I start in 2 weeks. That's wonderful," she replied, her smile widening, lighting her whole face. Ethan clapped his hands, dropping a crayon onto the bedspread. "See, Daddy, I told you the plane would help." He held up the toy airplane proudly, as though it had single-handedly landed the job. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, taking the toy gently from his son's hand. His gaze flicked to Clara, soft with gratitude. "Looks like this little thing has more power than I thought." Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms, a playful spark in her eyes. "Maybe you should let it guide you, then at least until you figure out the rest." There was a pause filled with the quiet hum of monitors and the warmth of shared understanding. Daniel nodded slowly, still holding the toy between them. "All right, we'll let the plane lead." Clara tilted her head, her voice gentler now. "And maybe we start with something simple. Friendship, no pressure, just seeing where it goes." Daniel exhaled as though he had been holding his breath since the moment they met. "Friends," he agreed, his tone carrying more than the word itself. Ethan looked from one to the other, his small smile widening. "Then we're a team," he said firmly, as if sealing the agreement. And in that quiet hospital room, under the pale wash of morning light, three lives that had once been separate began to bend toward each other, drawn together not by grand gestures or polished plans, but by laughter, kindness, in a chipped red airplane that suddenly seemed like the truest compass of all. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm none of them had expected. Clara flew back to Boston, her calendar packed with board meetings and investor calls. Yet her phone became the quiet anchor she carried everywhere between agenda items and late-night strategy sessions. She found herself waiting for a familiar ringtone, one that now mattered more than any quarterly projection. Their first video call had been simple. Ethan propped up against a pillow, holding the toy airplane high so Clara could see. "It worked," he declared proudly. "Daddy got the job because of this." Clara laughed, her voice softer than she remembered it could be. She told him she believed him, and in that moment, the distance between Boston and Seattle seemed to shrink. From then on, the calls became part of their days. Ethan insisted on showing her his drawings, his new favorite books, the messy attempts at building cardboard rockets in the living room. Sometimes Clara would be in a glass-walled conference room, the city skyline behind her, and Ethan would hold up a crayon-scribbled Saturn with all 62 moons labeled, though half were named after his favorite foods. Daniel would sit in the background, smiling quietly, the pride in his eyes impossible to miss. It didn't take long before phone calls turned into flights. Clara began booking weekend trips to Seattle under the guise of regional meetings. Daniel teased her about the excuses, but she only smiled, never correcting him. Each visit carried its own small rituals. Coffee runs from the shop across the street from the hospital. Walks through the park where Ethan ran ahead with his cape flapping behind him. Quiet dinners in Daniel's modest apartment, where laughter seemed to come easier than it ever had in Boston's sleek restaurants. Back in Boston, Clara found herself staring out of office windows longer than usual. For years, she had run her company like a fortress, every decision sharp, every hour accounted for. But now she was rearranging her calendar, creating remote work policies under the banner of modern flexibility. Her board applauded the innovation, never suspecting that the real reason was simpler. She wanted time. Time to be in Seattle. Time to sit on the floor with Ethan and help him tape cardboard wings to a shoebox. Time to hear Daniel's laugh in person instead of through a phone speaker. Half her life remained in Boston, polished and relentless, but the other half began to take root in Seattle. She learned the best flight times to avoid delays. She grew familiar with the airport gates, the rhythm of boarding calls, the small thrill of seeing Daniel waiting near baggage claim, with Ethan waving both arms like a flag. The distance was still there, measured in miles and hours, but it no longer felt like a wall. It was simply the space between 2 points that were slowly, deliberately drawing closer together. And somewhere between those flights, between the boardrooms and bedtime stories, Clara realized she was no longer just visiting. She was building a life that stretched across 2 cities, A life that held laughter and cardboard rockets and the gentle certainty of a man who had once been a stranger at gate 17. What had started as chance was now choice. A choice she made again and again every time she stepped onto a plane bound for Seattle. 1 year slipped by, almost without notice, woven together by video calls that became flights, and flights that became a rhythm as steady as breathing. By then, Seattle no longer felt like a place Clara visited. It had become another home, though she rarely admitted it aloud. Her company's new Midwest office was thriving, and tonight she was hosting her first gala in the city that had quietly changed her life. The ballroom glimmered with glass and light, filled with polish and laughter, and the hum of conversations about innovation and growth. Clara stood at the podium, her notes spread neatly in front of her speech rehearsed down to the cadence of each pause. Yet, as she looked out across the crowd, her eyes snagged on something near the door. Daniel in a black tuxedo that fit him so well it stole her breath for a moment. And beside him, Ethan dressed in a tiny suit with a clip-on bow tie, carrying something carefully behind his back. Clara faltered, her words catching in her throat. The audience shifted, murmuring at the pause, but she barely heard them. Her gaze was locked on the two figures making their way through the crowd. Ethan reached her first, climbing the steps with determination, and thrust a painted canvas into her hands. "I made it for you," he said proudly, his small voice carrying through the microphone she hadn't realized was still low enough for him to reach. On the canvas, three figures stood hand in hand beneath a starry sky. Above them, a plain sword. Saturn glowing in the corner with all 62 moons scattered like jewels. "That's us. We're a family now, right?" The room held its breath. Clara knelt down in her gown, pulling Ethan into her arms, her voice trembling. "Yes, sweetheart, we're a family." When she looked up, Daniel was there. Stepping onto the stage, his expression both nervous and certain, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, kneeling before her. In front of 300 of Seattle's business elite, he spoke into the microphone Ethan had just abandoned. "That flight a year ago was supposed to last 4 hours, he said, his voice steady, rich with meaning. "But Clara, it became the beginning of everything. I want to keep flying with you through turbulence and clear skies, through whatever life throws at us. Will you marry us, Ethan and me?" The boy, unable to contain himself, bounced on his toes. "Say yes. I already told everyone at school you would." Laughter rippled through the room, softening the hush of anticipation. Tears blurred Clara's vision, smudging the edges of her carefully applied makeup. Nothing about her life had gone according to the plan she once clung to, and for the first time, she was grateful for it. Her voice broke, but the words rang clear. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. But in the bubble of that stage, it was only the three of them. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger. Ethan wrapped his arms around both their legs, and the crowd melted into a blur of sound and light. Months later, beneath a sky streaked with gold, they stood beside Lake Washington, vows spoken in the presence of close friends and a handful of family. Clara wore a gown that shimmered like water. Daniel's hand steady in hers, and Ethan marched proudly down the aisle as the ring bearer, complete with soft, bare ears Clara had ordered just for him. Mrs. Alvarez cried through the entire ceremony as they exchanged rings. Daniel whispered, "That 4-hour flight gave me forever." And Clara, with tears on her cheeks and laughter in her voice, knew it was true. The chipped red airplane rested on the table of gifts that day. No longer just a toy, but the compass that had led them here, to a family neither of them had planned for, but both had needed more than they'd ever known. 3 years slipped by like pages turned too quickly, yet every one of them carried its own weight of memory. Clara and Daniel's life together was far from a perfect storybook, but it was real, full of laughter, stubborn arguments, Sunday mornings tangled in blankets, and a dog named Saturn, who somehow always managed to chew the wrong pair of shoes. Ethan had grown taller, all gangly limbs and boundless energy, yet the chipped red airplane still sat on his nightstand, a quiet reminder of the day everything began. On a quiet evening in their Seattle home, the house finally settled after a long day. Saturn dozed in the corner, his paws twitching in dream. Ethan lay asleep in his bed, the soft rise and fall of his chest illuminated by the small glow of a nightlight shaped like Saturn itself. Clara stood into the doorway, arms folded, her gaze lingering on the boy who had once been pale and fragile in a hospital bed, now whispering big dreams even in sleep. Daniel came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders, his voice low. "He's getting so big, 9 already." Clara leaned into him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Still can't pronounce Saturn right. Still calls it Satin." Daniel chuckled quietly, his eyes fixed on their son. "I don't ever want him to outgrow that." For a moment, silence stretched, filled only by the quiet hum of the house. Then Clara turned, her hand resting lightly on his. She hesitated, as though savoring the weight of what she was about to say. "I went to the doctor this morning." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, I'm pregnant." He froze, blinking at her, the words settling into his chest like dawn breaking over water. Then joy spread across his face, wide and unrestrained, and he pulled her into his arms before remembering to lower his voice so as not to wake Ethan. He spun her once, careful and laughing softly. "You're serious?" She nodded, her eyes shining. 7 months from now, Ethan's going to be a big brother." Daniel pressed his forehead to hers. "Overcome. Another adventure," he whispered. "The best kind," she answered, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. They stood there in the doorway together, watching their son sleep, his toy airplane clutched loosely in one hand, even in dreams. That small piece of plastic had once been nothing more than a child's charm, but now it felt like a compass, the silent witness to every step that had followed. A chance meeting, a shoulder offered, a choice to stay when either could have walked away. Outside the window, a plane crossed the night sky, its lights blinking softly against the darkness. Clara followed its arc with her eyes, remembering the weight of exhaustion that had pulled her into Daniel's shoulder at 30,000 feet. What had been nothing more than an accident had turned into the flight of her life. She tightened her grip on Daniel's hand, her voice steady, filled with wonder. It all started up there. He kissed her temple, his gaze never leaving Ethan. And it's still going, still flying in that quiet house with a sleeping boy, a dreaming dove, and a secret of new life growing between them. Clara and Daniel knew that some journeys aren't measured in hours or miles. Some journeys last forever, carrying you past every storm, every stretch of clear sky, until family itself becomes a destination. And as the night deepened, they held each other close, certain of one thing, that their flight was still in motion and always would be. What if I asked you to pause and reflect on the essence of Clara and Daniel's journey in this story? What do you notice about how a simple accident, falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder, unravels into profound connections, transforming isolation into family? Might it reveal a deeper truth about vulnerability, where letting down our guards in unexpected moments opens doors to love and purpose we never anticipated? Consider, in your own experiences, have you ever felt the weight of exhaustion like Clara, or the ache of responsibility like Daniel, and wondered how sharing those burdens could lead to healing? What emotions stir in you when you think about Ethan's innocent toy airplane becoming a symbol of fate, guiding 2 broken lives toward wholeness? Could this teach us that life's most valuable lessons often arrive not through planned ambition, but through serendipitous kindness, reminding us to embrace the turbulence, hold hands through storms, and trust that small acts of humanity can redefine our paths? Now imagine weaving these insights into a heartfelt message for an audience. How might you phrase it to evoke empathy, encouraging them to recognize similar miracles in their lives? Let's explore together. Perhaps start by drafting a few sentences on the emotional impact of chance encounters. What words would make it resonate deeply? Around 200, 300 words, ending with an inviting call to comment and subscribe. Share your thoughts, and we'll refine it step by step to foster that discovery.